So there's already loads and loads of material on small-sided games. So I'm not trying to reinvent the wheel or come up with anything amazingly new. It's just more about me giving my opinions on small-sided games and what a small-sided game is, how we should use them, and then how I use them, which may not be the perfect way, and people may agree or disagree. Which obviously I'm always happy to take feedback on. So for me, when you're doing a small-sided game, it must always resemble the game as closely as it can. That can include dimensions of the pitch. It's got to be an invasion type game as well, but it needs to look as much like the game as possible. So, and then you adapt the pitch size dependent on the age group of the players and how many players you're using it. So 2v2 for under sevens compared to a 2v2 for adults will be slightly different sizes. Like a 4v4, 3v3 would, you have to adjust the size of the pitch based on the adults players, but you also need to adjust the size of the pitch based on what outcomes you want. Do you want it to be tight so that it helps with close control, that it then challenges the defenders a little bit more in tight areas if they're playing against really skillful players? Or do you want it bigger, which will probably benefit the more physical players, and then that might make it difficult for defenders against the more physical players who might need to then work on their positioning and their shape. So you can adapt the sizes depending on what you want to work on. It doesn't always need to be the same. The key for me, and I mention it all the time, they have to have a lot of decision making in it. The players have to make a lot of decisions in the small-sided games. And that's why it's vital that it looks like the game to me, because you don't want them making decisions that they won't be making at the weekend. The decisions they're making have to relate to what the full game looks like when they're playing it. That's the bit to get right. Are they making decisions? So the decisions have got to be in realistic scenarios, which are massively important. So it's nice and simple for me. Instead of saying it's a one-touch finish, I always say if you finish one touch, it's worth 2 or 3 points instead of one. You're not changing the decision making, then you're still letting them make a decision about that type of finish. If someone needs to take 2 touches to finish, but it's the right thing to do at that moment in time, they're still allowed to do it. But you're still encouraging the one touch finish if you can get that to happen. So that's what I mean by allowing them to make decisions. So when you're saying you've got to play 2 touch, you are restricting their decision making. I'm not saying you can never do that. You might have a justification behind doing that. But for me, if you're doing small-sided games, make sure they let the players make lots of decisions. Now, half of that allowing players to make decisions is the coaches have to park their ego and let players get on with it and let players make mistakes, and they'll let players get things right as well. The skill as the coach is how you coach those players to help them with that decision making. So I don't agree with, personally, just let them get on with it until they figure it out. I think there has to be a point where you coach. Now, that first point might be a discussion. It might be some Q&As with the players. If they're really not getting it, it might get to the point where you go a bit command style and tell them. And then after you've been command style and tell them, ease off a little bit and then see if it's sunk in. Okay, but the skill of the coach is how do you affect players and help them improve their decision making? Hopefully that can be through your practice design and through little questions that you can answer rather than telling players. So another example of that is if you do a practice where you have 2 channels out wide and you say to players, you've got to go wide before you score. Okay, now for me, when you're playing, the first thing you should be teaching players is, can you penetrate? Can you play a penetrating pass as quickly as possibly can to advance us up the field? Now, one way that we can help ourselves make more penetrating passes is by creating a lot of width so that it spreads the opposition and create gaps for us to play through. So by playing the ball wide, you should naturally stretch the opposition and create width. Great. But if you start to do that and the opposition now start guessing and cheating and trying to go out wide early, they're allowing you opportunities to penetrate centrally. So if you say you've got to go wide, you take that away from them, and then you're affecting their decision making at the weekends. When if the ball is straight onto the striker's feet, a lot of the times you're going to want them to play that. So that's another thing to think about within those games. So let them make as many decisions as possible when they are younger, and when they're older, they will then be the best decision makers on the pitch. So for me, the best players as adults are the best decision makers. Okay, so if you ever play against players that have played at a really high level that are maybe not as fit anymore, they're a little bit slower than they used to be, you just watch them move around the pitch and the decisions they make. They're so hard to play against if you've not played at that level. And that's nothing to do with fitness or speed. It's to do with their intelligence and the decisions that they make. So we need to let players make as many decisions as they can when they're younger, so they get better at it when they're older. Okay, I use 2v2, 3v3 and 4v4 with all age groups. And I see a massive benefit to that, especially with 2v2 and 3v3, because you're either on the ball or you need to be supporting the ball. There's no hiding. You're always involved within the game. And then 4v4 will create these little tactical situations that you can work on, and you can work on any scenario with them, especially if you're clever with your practice design. Stick to the small versions of the game. Players will then get better at the bigger versions of the game. And to justify that thought, whenever you look at a pitch, whether that's 5-a-side, 7-a-side, 9-a-side, or 11-a-side, and take a photo from above it, all you will see around that pitch is 1v1s, 2v1s, 2v2s, 3v2s, 3v3s. So you don't really need to work in more than that, in my opinion, especially at the younger age groups, to drip feed in principles of how you want them to play. Even if you're doing 2v2 and you want players to be able to penetrate, okay, if you've got a goal at each end and you say, right, it's 2v2, but as soon as you can score in the goal, play forward and score in the goal, you'll get players combining, but then looking for that forward pass straight into the goal. Okay, so you're not just teaching them combination play, you're teaching them combine in order to play forward. So for me, a game can be a 2v2, a 3v3, a 4v4. And then you think about your scenarios that you put in and the situations that you're putting into that. They need to be realistic to what it looks like at the weekend. And then you've got to let them make decisions. That's how, for me, you make a small-sided game really effective at all age groups. So I'm running a webinar in the next few weeks to make sure that I'm passing on a bit more information if I can. It will include a lot of session plans about small-sided games that I've used. And I'll get people to share ones that they've used as well if they're happy to do that. You can sign up through the link for that webinar. And if you can't watch it live, it will be recorded and posted after that on the TSC Coaches Club, as well as sent out to our TSC Coaches Club newsletter. So sign up for any of those if you want to attend live or receive it afterwards.